When an avoidant goes silent, most people rush to the wrong conclusion. They assume silence means certainty. They think it means emotional control, detachment, strength, or indifference. But that interpretation misses what's actually happening beneath the surface. Silence in the avoidant world is rarely a position of power. More often, it's a retreat driven by shame. Here's the uncomfortable truth. People don't withdraw from situations they feel good about. Human beings lean into experiences that affirm their self-image. We pull away from anything that threatens it. For the avoidant, facing you means facing a version of themselves they don't want to see. The one who mishandled something meaningful, the one who shut down instead of showing up, the one who chose self-protection over connection. Shame isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic apologies or emotional breakdowns. Shame is quiet. It whispers, if I stay here, I'll have to acknowledge what I did. And so the avoidant chooses distance, not because they're unbothered, but because proximity activates an internal reckoning they're not prepared to handle. This is where psychology matters. Avoidant attachment is built on an early lesson. Emotional closeness equals danger. Vulnerability equals loss of control. So when they sense that they failed you, disappointed you, or hurt you, especially someone who offered genuine connection, their nervous system reacts as if they're under threat. Silence becomes regulation. Disappearance becomes survival. Notice how this reframes the behavior. Their quiet isn't superiority, it's self-preservation. It's not, I don't care. It's, I can't tolerate the emotional consequences of caring and falling short. And that distinction changes everything about how you interpret their absence. Philosophically, shame attacks identity, not behavior. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, there is something wrong with me. For the avoidant, admitting harm doesn't feel like correcting a mistake. It feels like confirming a deep fear they've carried for years, that they are inadequate in intimacy. So rather than risk that collapse, they retreat into silence where the narrative stays unchallenged. This is why closure rarely comes from them. Closure would require dialogue, reflection, and emotional presence. And emotional presence is exactly where shame has the strongest grip. Silence allows them to avoid the mirror. It allows them to keep moving without having to integrate the lesson of the relationship. But here's what most people miss. Shame doesn't dissolve just because someone walks away. It follows. It resurfaces in quiet moments, in comparison, in regret, in late-night thoughts that can't be outrun. Silence might reduce immediate discomfort, but it doesn't create peace. It creates unfinished business within the self. And that's why avoidants often struggle when they see you moving on, healing, or becoming emotionally grounded without them. Your growth reactivates what they tried to bury. It reminds them that the connection was real and that their exit had a cost. If you've ever wondered why their absence feels heavier than their presence ever did, this is why. You weren't dealing with indifference. You were dealing with someone who couldn't face the version of themselves that your connection revealed. So don't interpret their silence as your insignificance. Silence is not the absence of feeling, it's the avoidance of accountability. And when someone avoids accountability, it's because on some level, they know there's something to account for. The truth is simple. Even if it's painful, they didn't walk away because you didn't matter. They walked away because you mattered enough to confront what they couldn't. After silence comes something even more subtle and often more damaging to the person on the receiving end, the rewriting of the story. When an avoidant can't tolerate the weight of guilt, they don't always deny what happened outright. Instead, they reshape it, they soften it. They distort it just enough to make themselves feel safer inside their own mind. This is how the human psyche protects itself when accountability feels unbearable. We don't just avoid pain physically, we avoid it cognitively. We edit memory. We reinterpret intention. We minimize impact. And for the avoidant, this process isn't calculated manipulation. It's psychological survival. If they told the story exactly as it happened, they'd have to sit with the truth that threatens their self-image. So you'll hear phrases like, it wasn't that serious, or we were never really that close, or you wanted more than I could give. On the surface, these statements sound neutral, even reasonable, but underneath them is a powerful defensive move, turning a shared emotional reality into something small enough to dismiss. Not because it was small, but because its full size is too heavy to carry. From a psychological standpoint, this is called cognitive dissonance reduction. When someone's actions conflict with their internal values, like seeing themselves as decent, fair, or emotionally aware, the mind looks for relief. One way to resolve that tension is to change the behavior. Another is to change the story about the behavior. Avoidants almost always choose the second option because changing the behavior requires vulnerability, growth, and emotional risk. Philosophically, this is where responsibility meets identity. If the relationship mattered deeply and if you were genuinely hurt, then the avoidant must confront a painful conclusion. I played a role in someone. Ease pain. That realization isn't just uncomfortable, it destabilizes the narrative they use to feel okay about themselves. So the mind intervenes. It reframes the connection as mismatched, exaggerated, or doomed from the start. Notice how often avoidants frame the ending as inevitable. It would have ended anyway. We were too different. The timing was wrong. These explanations are soothing because they remove agency. If the outcome was unavoidable, then no one has to take responsibility. Fate replaces choice. Circumstance replaces accountability. But here's the part most people don't understand: rewriting. The story doesn't erase guilt, it buries it. And buried emotions don't disappear. They resurface indirectly through anxiety, defensiveness, emotional numbness, or a persistent sense that something unresolved is following them from relationship to relationship. The cost of avoiding guilt is a fragmented sense of self. This is also why you might feel confused, gaslit, or invalidated when you hear their version of events. It can feel like you live two completely different realities. And in a way, you did. Not because your perception is flawed, but because one of you is protecting truth and the other is protecting identity. The danger here for you is internalizing their revised narrative. When you start questioning whether it really meant anything, whether you asked for too much, whether you imagined the depth, you begin carrying their unresolved guilt for them. That's not healing, that's displacement. Truth doesn't need to be minimized to be survivable, but avoidance teaches people that emotional truth is dangerous, overwhelming, and destabilizing, so they reduce it, not realizing that by shrinking the past, they also shrink their capacity for future intimacy. The deeper truth is this: if it truly didn't matter, it wouldn't need to be rewritten. People only edit stories that still have emotional charge. Indifference doesn't require justification. Detachment doesn't need explanation. The urge to redefine what happened is itself evidence that what happened still matters. So when you hear the story change, don't argue with it. Don't chase validation. Understand what you're witnessing. You're not being erased. You're being reinterpreted so they can live with themselves. And here's the grounding: truth to hold on to. A connection that has to be minimized to be tolerated was real enough to be feared. There's a moment that often surprises people who've been entangled with an avoidant. It isn't when the avoidant leaves. It isn't even the silence or the rewritten story. It's what happens later when you begin to heal, stabilize, and step back into your own life with clarity and strength. That's the moment something shifts inside them, not outwardly, not in a way they'll easily admit, but internally, where defenses are harder to maintain. Your healing becomes a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous for people who've spent a lifetime avoiding self-exam. Ination. Psychologically, avoidant individuals rely on distance to regulate their emotions. As long as the other person appears needy, broken, or stuck, the avoidant can maintain a sense of emotional superiority or justification. The story stays intact. I had to leave. It was too much. I was protecting myself. But when you stop chasing, stop explaining, and start grounding yourself, that narrative begins to crack. Because now the evidence no longer supports it. Philosophically, human beings measure themselves in relation to others. We understand who we are by contrast. When you were hurting, confused, or reaching for answers, the avoidant could unconsciously position themselves as the one with control. But when you grow, when you become calm, self-directed, and emotionally coherent, you disrupt that hierarchy. You force a comparison they didn't prepare for. And here's the uncomfortable part. Your healing suggests that the problem wasn't emotional closeness itself. It suggests that growth was possible, and that implication lands hard. Because if healing is possible for you, then the avoidant must face the possibility that they didn't leave because they had to, but because they couldn't stay present. This is where shame deepens, not because they lost you, but because they lost an opportunity to become more than they were. Your progress highlights the road they didn't take. And for someone whose identity is built on emotional self-sufficiency, realizing that they may have stagnated while you evolved can trigger an internal collapse. This doesn't always look dramatic. Often it shows up as restlessness, irritation, curiosity disguised as indifference. They check in indirectly. They watch from a distance. They ask mutual connections about you. They oscillate between relief and regret. This isn't manipulation. It's disorientation. Their internal framework is being challenged. From a nervous system perspective, this is destabilizing. Avoidants rely on predictability and control. When you stop reacting the way you used to, when you no longer fit the role they unconsciously assigned, they lose their emotional bearings. The dynamic that once made sense no longer does. And notice this, it's not your pain that activates their conscience. It's your wholeness. Pain can be rationalized. Healing cannot. Healing removes the excuses. It strips away the story that says, I had no choice, because now you're standing there whole, stable, and grounded without them, and that reality demands reflection. This is why avoidants often struggle most, not during conflict, but during peace, when everything is quiet, when there's nothing external to blame. The unresolved questions surface. Could I have handled that differently? Did I run from something real? Did I abandon growth in the name of comfort? Your healing doesn't punish them, but it confronts them, and confrontation for someone who avoids emotional depth can feel like collapse. This is where your power lies, even if you never intend it. By choosing growth over resentment, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over pursuit, you stop participating in their internal avoidance. You become an undeniable reference point, not as someone they defeated or escaped, but as someone who outgrew the dynamic entirely. And here's the final truth to anchor yourself in. When your healing destabilizes someone, it's because your strength exposes what they were never ready to face. Once you understand the shame, the rewritten story, and the way your healing unsettles them, their confusing behavior starts to make sense. The late night messages. The sudden warmth followed by disappearance. The watching without engaging. The reaching out that feels emotional but goes nowhere. What looks chaotic from the outside is actually the product of a very specific internal conflict. Avoidants don't live in emotional emptiness. They live in emotional contradiction. One part of them longs for relief from the unresolved tension, the shame, the unfinished connection, the sense that something meaningful was left incomplete. Another part is wired to associate closeness with danger. These two forces pull in opposite directions, and the result is inconsistency. From a psychological perspective, this is an approach avoidance conflict. The same person is simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of threat. You represent connection, familiarity, and emotional truth, but you also represent accountability, vulnerability, and exposure. So the avoidant moves toward you to soothe the discomfort, then pulls away when the emotional intensity rises. This is why mixed signals feel personal, but aren't. They aren't calibrated to hurt you. They're calibrated to regulate themselves. Contact reduces internal pressure. Distance restores control. The problem is that this regulation comes at the expense of clarity, stability, and trust. Philosophically, this speaks to an unresolved relationship with responsibility. To fully re-engage would require presence, consistency, and a willingness to face what was left unsaid. To fully disengage would require acceptance, grief, and closure. Avoidants often choose neither. They hover in the middle, not because it's satisfying, but because it postpones pain. This limbo is emotionally exhausting for both people, but it's especially destabilizing for the one who values coherence. Humans need patterns to feel safe. Mixed signals break pattern recognition. They keep you searching for meaning where there is only ambivalence, and if you're not careful, you'll start interpreting their inconsistency as a puzzle to solve rather than a boundary to respect. Here's the crucial reframe. Inconsistency is not depth. Intensity is not intention. And emotional access without emotional follow-through is not connection. It's conflict leaking outward. Avoidants often mistake emotional activation for intimacy. Feeling stirred doesn't mean they're ready to engage. It just means something inside them is unresolved. So they reach out, not to build something new, but to quiet something old. When the discomfort subsides, the avoidance returns. This explains why their contact rarely leads to resolution. They don't come with clarity, they come with tension. They don't ask direct questions, they test emotional waters. They don't offer grounding, they offer signals. And signals without action keep everyone stuck. From a nervous system lens, this pattern makes sense. Avoidants are hyper-attuned to autonomy. When closeness threatens that autonomy, their system triggers withdrawal. When distance becomes too isolating, their system seeks connection again. Without conscious awareness and emotional skill, this cycle repeats automatically. The danger for you is believing that consistency will eventually emerge if you respond correctly, that if you're patient enough, calm enough, understanding enough, they'll settle into clarity. But regulation through another person is not sustainable. Until someone can tolerate their own internal conflict, they cannot offer stable presence to anyone else. This is where power shifts back to you. Understanding the mechanism removes the mystery. Mixed signals stop feeling seductive and start feeling informative. They tell you where someone is emotionally, not where they're going. You don't need to punish, chase, or diagnose. You simply need to recognize that someone who cannot choose clarity is choosing self-protection or connection. And that choice, while understandable, has consequences. Here's the grounding truth to hold on to. When someone's behavior is inconsistent, it's not because they're unsure about you. It's because they're at war with themselves. At some point, people begin to ask the question that lingers beneath everything else. If they feel so much, if they're conflicted, if they're watching from a distance, why can't they just apologize? Why is something so simple? 2 words, I'm sorry, so impossibly hard? The answer isn't indifference. It's exposure. An apology is not just an admission of behavior. It's an admission of impact. It says, I see what I did, I understand how it affected you, and I accept responsibility for that. For someone with avoidant patterns, that level of emotional visibility can feel profoundly unsafe. It requires standing still in the presence of another person's feelings without retreating, deflecting, or minimizing. And that is exactly what avoidance is designed to prevent. Psychologically, an apology collapses defenses. Avoidants rely on emotional distance to maintain equilibrium. When they apologize, that distance disappears. Suddenly, there's no buffer between their internal world and yours. There's no story to hide behind. There's just the truth, spoken out loud, witnessed by someone who mattered, and that's the part people miss. Apologies are relational acts. They don't happen in isolation. They happen between 2 people. For someone who equates closeness with loss of control, that interpersonal exposure can feel more threatening than remaining silent and misunderstood. Philosophically, an apology is an act of humility. It places truth above ego and connection above self-protection. It acknowledges imperfection without collapsing into shame. But shame is exactly where avoidants fear they'll land. They don't trust that they can admit fault and remain intact, so they choose silence, justification, or partial accountability instead. This is why avoidant apologies, when they do appear, often feel incomplete. I'm sorry if you felt hurt. I didn't mean to upset you. These statements acknowledge discomfort without accepting responsibility. They reduce emotional risk. While maintaining distance. They're not insincere. They're constrained by fear. From a nervous system perspective, apologizing activates vulnerability circuits that avoidants have spent years suppressing. The body reads it as danger. Heart rate increases. Defenses activate. Withdrawal feels safer than repair. And so the opportunity for healing passes, not because the desire isn't there, but because the capacity isn't. For the person waiting on the other side, this can be devastating. You may interpret the lack of apology as a lack of care, or worse, a denial of your experience. But what's actually happening is that the avoidant is choosing emotional survival over emotional maturity. This doesn't excuse the harm. Understanding the mechanism doesn't minimize the impact. It simply explains why remorse can exist without repair and regret can exist without reconciliation. The deeper cost of avoiding apology is internal. When someone can't acknowledge harm, they can't fully integrate the experience. It remains fragmented. The lesson stays unlearned. And that's why similar patterns repeat across relationships. Growth requires ownership. Without it, the same pain gets reenacted in different forms. For you, the turning point comes when you stop waiting for an apology to validate your reality. Your pain doesn't require their confirmation to be real. Healing doesn't require their words to be legitimate. An apology is meaningful, but it's not the gatekeeper of your peace. And here's the most important distinction. Someone can regret losing you and still be unable to apologize for how they treated you. Regret is internal. An apology is relational. One can exist without the other. So when the apology never comes, don't assume your worth was invisible. Sometimes the apology is absent not because the harm was small, but because acknowledging it would dismantle the very defenses they rely on to function. Hold this truth steady. An apology requires courage, and avoidance is the absence of it. After everything you've examined, the silence, the rewritten story, the way your healing unsettled them, the mixed signals, the missing apology, the final realization has to land somewhere solid. Otherwise, all that insight turns inward and becomes self-blame. And this is where the perspective shifts from analysis to freedom, because the hardest truth for most people to accept is not that the avoidant struggled. It's that you were never the problem they were running from. They weren't ashamed of loving you. They were ashamed of how they showed up or failed to. When love asks something of them, human beings don't withdraw from what they feel beneath. They withdraw from what exposes their limits. An intimate connection has a way of doing exactly that. It reveals emotional capacity, resilience, availability, and courage. When someone pulls away in the face of real connection, it's rarely because the other person asked for too much. It's because the moment demanded more than they could sustainably give. Psychologically, avoidant attachment is not about lacking feeling. It's about lacking tolerance for dependency, for emotional complexity, for sustained vulnerability. So when you offered presence, openness, or consistency, it wasn't your needs that overwhelmed them. It was the gap between who they wanted to be and who they were able to be in that moment. This is why shame sits so close to avoidance. Shame arises when our internal ideal collides with our lived behavior. The avoidant often wants to be emotionally capable. They want to see themselves as kind, decent, self-aware. But when their actions fall short, when they distance, deflect, disappear, that self-image fractures, and instead of repairing the behavior, they retreat from the situation that exposed the fracture. Philosophically, this is the difference between worth and capacity. Your worth is intrinsic. It doesn't fluctuate based on someone else's readiness. Capacity, on the other hand, is developmental. It's shaped by history, self-awareness, and emotional skill. Confusing the two is what causes unnecessary suffering. When someone with limited emotional capacity encounters someone who is emotionally available, the imbalance becomes obvious. Not because one person is superior, but because one person is further along